Japan was once expected to become the largest economy in the world. From the aftermath of the Second World War, a concentrated rebuilding and industrialisation effort made Japan the first advanced economy in Asia, and in the decades that followed, a combination of a legendary work ethic, a strong industrial focus, and technological advances made it the second largest economy on the planet. For a while, the relatively small islands were within economic striking distance of the much larger and much more populous USA. Even to this day, movies, video games, and other media in the semi-dystopian cyberpunk genre heavily feature Japanese companies, text, and iconography because, for a long time, it represented people's expectations for a future where advanced Japanese companies would rule the world. What we actually got instead was a bunch of California tech businesses, which doesn't feel better, but anyway, the point is that the expectation for Japanese dominance permeated everything. Now, of course, that future never came. Japan's economy has been stagnant for close to 4 decades now, and far from being the world's largest economy, it's recently lost its place on the podium altogether to that other post-war miracle. Today, it's currently making headlines for the declining value of its currency and that week last year where it got cute and teased blowing up the global financial system. Japan's rise and plateau have captivated the entire career of countless economists, all trying to figure out exactly what went wrong and what can be done to fix it. But after so much time, it might actually be more important to ask if this is even a problem at all. Japanese people still enjoy a very high quality of life. They don't have the same problems that we do with unaffordable housing. They have some of the highest life expectancies in the world. The cost of living has been more sustainable. And despite their reputation for overworking, they're actually now putting in fewer hours than a lot of countries in the West. So, has Japan fully embraced economic stagnation? What are the benefits of doing so? And finally, perhaps most importantly, can it remain stagnant forever without some serious side effects? Making a video that looks professional can feel like a lot of work. Writing scripts, editing, finding the right visuals, it's overwhelming, especially if video creation isn't your main gig. But with today's sponsor, InVideo AI, things get a whole lot easier and more exciting. InVideo AI launched V3, which puts you in the director's seat and brings your imagination to reality better than any tool out there, irrespective of your skill level. Let's say you want to make a video for your business to show off your products or your team, but you don't have hours to spend learning video editing or putting the materials together. Here's how it works. With InVideo AI as your creative partner, you simply type out what you want. For example, you could say, make a video about the benefits of farm-to-table foods to promote my new organic bakery, and in seconds, InVideo AI will generate a full professional video based on your prompt.
In a world of processed foods, there's a revolution happening.
It's cool because it does all the heavy lifting and lets you create eye-catching promos even if video production isn't your focus. You can tweak it with simple text commands, adjust visuals, and even add your own voice for narration. You can try InVideo AI for free. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. Click the link in the description to check out InVideo AI V3. In 1985, the US, France, West Germany, the UK, and Japan met at a 5,400 square foot luxury hotel in New York City to finalise a joint agreement aptly named the Plaza Accord, after the establishment of the same name. And whilst most of these agreements seemed amicable on the surface, with world leaders sitting for the ritualistic photo op, the fact of the matter was that the US had become increasingly concerned over the growth in these competing nations, specifically Japan, and without hindsight, they had reason to be. Fearing the manufacturing power coming from the east, a deal was struck between the 5 nations where the USA would artificially lower the value of its own currency to make itself more competitive and, more importantly, Japanese exports less competitive. Obviously, this was a great deal for the US. If an American car dealer now wanted to purchase a Japanese vehicle, they would have to exchange their US dollars for an artificially higher price yen, ultimately losing prior incentives to buy foreign because now they'd be paying more. So why would Japan, an export-dependent country that was suspected of possibly eclipsing everyone at the table, brazenly bend the knee to such an unorthodox request? Well, the short answer to this is that they weren't stupid. Of course, Japan knew that signing off on the agreement would hurt their export-led economy. However, they also understood that harming their symbiotic relationship with the West with a passive trade war would ultimately hurt them more. After all, the US was providing food for Japan's growing population, along with resources to increase output, while Japan was using these necessities to produce affordable consumer tech products. It'd be nice if people could just eat their old pair of headphones when the fridge is empty, but without mincing words, Japan only had 2 options: potential hunger and decline, or a manageable foreign exchange shift. Plus, at the time, the Plaza Accord appeared to benefit both parties. American manufacturing became more competitive, while the Japanese yen's rise in value made them rich, allowing citizens to go on a massive spending spree buying trips, real estate, and even US companies. However, by 1997, in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, the party in Japan, packed with billion-dollar expense accounts, major stock investments, and real estate speculation, came to an abrupt end. Since then, robotic weighted novelties aside, the economy of Japan has gone from an economy of the future, 20 years ahead, to a stagnant country stuck in its glory days, arguably 20 years behind the same countries that once feared their rise to prominence. And while there is no single explanation for why this happened, there are some causes that really stand out. Causes that paradoxically help them to succeed in the first place, as well as an argument for how they essentially embraced their current situation. Outside of the boom preceding the Asian financial crisis, Japanese society had a long history of risk aversion, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of countries do the opposite and pay the price. But what makes this uniquely Japanese is the reason they chose not to take risks in the first place. Putting it lightly, the country has a reputation for perfection, to the point where it's become a widely accepted stereotype. In most of their practices, whether it be food or the countless katana smithing videos on YouTube, a lot of its people spend years specialising in niche fields to provide the best possible product or service, and business is no exception. This meant that when the market crashed, people all over the country were devastated. This shake-up reinforced the fears of going against the grain to be an entrepreneur. The vast majority chose to play it safe, getting a salaryman job, something considered more stable and respectable. Moreover, even if someone does decide to make their own way, desiring to start their own business, the amount of hurdles a hopeful has to go through to make that happen, obtaining registration, seeking approval from the Ministry of Justice, tax officers, and potentially multiple government barriers, leaves little incentive to try. This has meant that Japan, which was once synonymous with technical innovation, has fallen well behind places like Silicon Valley, Seoul, and Shenzhen. In the early 2000s, saying an electronic gizmo was Japanese was basically the same thing as saying it was some crazy piece of cutting-edge technology. Today, they don't even market competitive smartphones, the singular piece of consumer technology that's basically rendered everything else they used to make obsolete. A lot of this is purely down to a lack of innovation, and the lack of innovation is down to people who don't want to take the risks of innovating. The World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index ranked Japan 29th for how easy it is to start a business. Now, that's not terrible if regulations were the only obstacle. However, there are additional barriers that make this ranking a bit more challenging to escape, especially for foreigners. Specifically their national language. For better or worse, English is the de facto language of business, and Japan simply doesn't make it a priority, believing, at least to an extent, it would mean abandoning tradition, with rough estimates suggesting only 15 to 28% of the population is able to speak the language, 8% speak it fluently. Of course, not only is this a hurdle in the realm of basic international business cooperation, but most modern technology tends to be developed in English, and it's easier to reach global adoption if it's done in English first. All this is to say that Japan is culturally resistant to change, and historically, the only moments where there have been significant levels of change is when they were forced to adopt to massive societal shifts and threats. Not to mention their long life expectancy mixed with low birth rates means that people are old, and this isn't a great recipe for a possible tech revolution anytime soon. For a country that once became one of the richest in the world almost solely from these advancements, this situation might seem a bit bleak. But this is only because many promote the idea that a stagnant economy is a bad economy. Popular figures like Lawrence Summers, Paul Krugman, Robert J. Gordon, and others have made suggestions in the past that such a slowdown for an advanced economy can be institutionally lethal, resulting in high unemployment, low wage growth, fiscal strain, and all of the lovely public unrest that often follows. And yet, Japan appears to be the perfect counterexample. Its economy has not seen sustained growth for over 3 decades now, and at least on the surface, it hasn't collapsed in on itself like those pessimistic economists would expect. But the question is, why? Perhaps it's not stagnation that's the problem, but rather how a nation's economy confronts it. For starters, Japan has had very low levels of inflation, in part due to their cultural resistance to change. In the past, businesses have had to issue public apologies for raising their prices, so there is the general consumer expectation that prices stay the same, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. We'll get to the bad later, but it's a good thing because it's meant that even stagnant wages have been able to maintain purchasing power domestically, something that has allowed businesses to avoid the wage increases seen in other developed nations. In part, this has led to extremely consistent job security, with 87% of people aged between 15 and 64 in paid positions, 11% above the global average. They also possess a high standard of living, all thanks to Japan's stellar reputation for high-level institutions. Both domestically and abroad, Japan is lauded for its extremely low crime rates, which only appear to have dropped lower and lower aside from a brief climb leading up to the 21st century, which is important to note because, at least in part, this can be attributed to many opportunities that citizens have to succeed. For example, education stands as one of the largest budgets in the country's general account, with spending in 2024 amounting to 8.51 trillion yen, or about $55 billion US. And while spending using the US for comparison isn't an indication of a lot of progress, Japan consistently gets a return on its investment, often leading in critical areas of study. In other words, they've proven that they can do a lot with far less. Of course, the country has a reputation for its intense work culture, with people routinely doing nothing but going to the office and sleeping, and while that definitely does happen in some companies, At this point, it's more of an over-reported myth than a common reality. In fact, they now put in fewer hours annually than US workers. That said, it has to be acknowledged that both countries work a lot of unreported overtime, so take these figures with a bucket of salt, it's all pretty speculative. Regardless, the stagnant Japan has also seemingly solved one of the other major issues plaguing almost every other advanced economy in the world today: affordable housing. For most developed countries, real estate is the defining economic problem. Young people around the world have all but resigned themselves to the fact that they won't own their living space for the foreseeable future. In Japan, this is a foreign concept. Even in Tokyo, with no expectation of future growth, homes are seen as consumable items like a car, not as an investment, so people don't really hype them up. The one important caveat to this is that Japanese homes by Western standards are incredibly small, so if you want a Western-style home in Tokyo, it's still going to be expensive. And before anyone assumes that a Japanese citizen can just start buying everything up to create a massive amount of assets, Japan has actually done something to prevent that from spiralling out of control: the inheritance tax. As an older nation, the country has created a tax of wealth passed down from one generation to another, which can range from 10% all the way up to 55% depending on how much is received, and this includes Japanese assets held by people who don't live in the country. The laws have changed slightly over the years, but the threshold has remained largely the same since inception. This can be a really great thing, especially for a stagnant economy, because it ensures that people who are trying to move up in the world have a chance to do so. For most of human history, the global economy has been largely economically stagnant, and without a growing pie, lords passed everything to their children, and peasants remained just as poor as their great-great-grandparents because all of the land and assets had already been taken. Growth is a useful tool to promote social mobility, and without it, an economy must have some kind of alternative mechanism to make sure those who are born poor aren't guaranteed to die poor. Now, it doesn't need to be an inheritance tax, but this example has helped to keep Japan relatively mobile, despite its stagnation and rigid traditions in other areas. If Japan's top-heavy population is considered a mounting concern, with stellar institutional strength and high quality of life all continually redistributed to an extent, then why can't they just open their doors to the outside world and encourage more growth? Well, the short answer is, they hate you. Well, sort of. The social media tourism certainly hasn't done anyone seeking to live abroad any favours. The answer is a bit more complicated than that, and once again, there is a lot of nuance to this. Historically, any time Japan has accepted outside assistance, it hasn't really gone in their favour. Bad trade deals and complicated historical relations have left a bad taste in their mouths when it comes to accepting outsiders. It's almost hereditary. It's a delicate subject, however the bottom line is that they have a very rigid cultural norms that they do not wish to jeopardise. Moreover, given the crises witnessed in other countries at this time, unfortunately economies are realising that immigration alone isn't an economic cheat code. But this brings a much larger issue to the table. Japan is just one example of what will most likely happen to the rest of the world economically. In other words, they aren't the only nation with an ageing population or confronting a slowdown. They aren't even the worst. As our own economies age, we might need to realise that our growth will slow too, and that's why it's important to talk about how stagnation has been a burden for a country like Japan, even with its institutional prowess. Because whether we like it or not, plenty of other countries are waiting in line. In the case of Japan, there are some clear side effects to its resistance to change, particularly in business. It's true that the vast majority of those capable of working in Japan are employed, and companies do tend to hold on to workers, giving them something to do instead of firing them. And on one hand, this is great because most workers don't feel the same at-will employment pressure witnessed overseas, but on the other hand, it also means that a lot of people are essentially doing busy work that other countries have since automated. This in turn has been very harmful to Japanese productivity as a whole, making their broader situation even worse. You can't stop Excel because it would make a team of people with abacuses redundant. And for them, especially on the tech front, no innovation leads to no growth, which has a compounding effect accelerating creative decline. Japan has incredibly traditional corporate hierarchies that are very entrenched in their way of conducting business, to the extent where people sometimes hire outsiders just to quit their jobs. Since there are no new companies coming up, there is currently a situation where people are essentially waiting in line until higher-ups are deceased, and with such a high life expectancy, this doesn't bode well for anyone trying to get ahead. This really puts more than just the country's business practices into perspective. It makes economists wonder if the problem has actually been solved. Japan appears to be containing the fire, not putting it out. The country's debt is piling up faster than ever before, and sure, in the past they've managed to sell this debt off to their own people, but this creates its own problems as that money could have been invested into new businesses, but instead it's been lent to the government. The government has borrowed a lot to keep the economy at its current baseline in an effort to not fall behind. Though this hasn't caused any problems yet, they're truly entering uncharted territory as it's raising interest rates for the first time in decades. What's more is that zooming out to a global scale, as other countries become richer around Japan, it's going to lose global relevance, and its local people aren't going to be able to enjoy overseas holidays or imported foreign goods, which is an actual tangible quality of life problem. Again, the only reason this is not such a big deal yet is because Japan had such a commanding lead before it stopped pushing forward. The country became so absurdly rich leading up to the 21st century that it's been able to coast on this success, and it's been able to hold on to this safety net by avoiding asset bubbles, possessing low inflation and keeping wages consistent. But little by little, Japan has been slipping away from its cushy position. At its peak, the country was almost twice as productive per capita as the USA, and today, it's half as productive. So this really begs the question, one not exclusive to Japan: can any country remain stagnant forever without serious side effects? Well, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists. This is uncharted territory, everyone is witnessing something that has literally never happened before. The fact is, for most of human history, output growth was minimal. Aside from a few infinitesimally small blips, global GDP has reached unimaginable heights in an incredibly short amount of time, making us all much wealthier overall. The expectation was that this growth would continue forever, but perhaps in hindsight that was naive. Economists might not be able to solve all issues by just growing our way out of it anymore, which means issues like social mobility, inequality, and how to effectively allocate those stagnant resources may become the primary focus. Now, surprisingly, all of this is true for Japan with one exception, the city of Tokyo, which has become so large and wealthy it's almost a city-state unto itself. We made an entire video about this weird paradox last year, and should be able to click to that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.